Just trying to. Let's see, where is it? Okay. Tracking women through historic records can be harder than men. There are reasons for that. And so what I'm hoping to do today is walk you through some of the places you may find information about women that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of outright at the start. Now, there's some things I can't help you with. This is a death notice in a Massachusetts newspaper that says in Boston on Saturday last, an unfortunate young female who was in apparent health at 3 p.m. was a corpse at 5. So if this is your several greats aunt, sorry, I can't help you with this. Now, I would be interested if, and the reason I chose, I've seen some others where it's an unnamed, but it turns out, they're late enough that there's a police force. This is early enough that there's no real police in Boston. So that's why I figured I'd start with this one to show you that it could be worse. This could be your several greats aunt. So this is a picture. Jessie Sears Leroy was my great grandmother. Now, the first thing I want to point out on this is not anything to do with female ancestors. Do not use Scotch tape on photographs, period. You will drive future librarians and archivists crazy if you notice the Scotch tape on this. And at this point, there's no way to remove the Scotch tape without harming the photograph. So, and this isn't as bad as some, but I've seen somewhere the tape goes right over somebody's face. So this is this is my grandfather's sister, then their mother, grandmother, great grandmother, and this points out one of the reasons tracing women can be harder is that traditionally in English-speaking societies, except for Scotland, women changed their name on marriage. They didn't in Scotland. We'll see a sample of that later. And so this is the problem, is that, what name are you looking for her under? And as you can see, I did the maiden name and married name, and you can see how it nicely tracks. So I've been talking about this a lot lately to people, this idea of someone's genealogical identity. And basically, it's the idea of what data are you collecting about a person that tells you this unique person in all of history is this person. I've got a name, I've got a location, I've got an event, I know who they're related to by birth, marriage, and adoption. And I know there are other connections. Where did they go to school? What church did they go to? Were they a Rotary member? I found out my grandfather evidently did something to tip off his local Masonic lodge and they suspended him. Which, according to what I've heard, and you'll see a bit about my grandparents' marriage later in this, so keep that in mind. And again, for women, traditionally, you'll end up with multiple names. You may end up with multiple locations if they are in a culture where women traditionally moved to where their husband's family was from. Now, there are cases in England, Scotland, Ireland, where the tradition was a couple got married in the wife's home church, moved to where his family lived, she went back to her mother's to have the first baby, and then had the other babies in her new home where her husband's family was. And so it can be easy to miss a first child that way, which then makes it harder to predict when the wedding might have taken place. Because if you say, well, they had a baby in November of 1815, probably got married in 1814, but the first child may have been 2 years earlier, and the marriage then a couple years earlier as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And a lot of times what helps you get the ones across the top are these two. Is by searching through a woman's relationships and connections. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's why I put them in that order, so that you start with, because most of us start with a name. And then you go around the star.
And sometimes the name is a debacle because it's never spelled right or twisted or.
Spelling doesn't count. We'll get to that as well. So anyhow, showing this again, because this also shows relationships. The name change shows you a relationship. And so that's one way to think, instead of getting frustrated that a woman's name changed, think about it that you now have two names that are connected. These two families connected. They're related. And sometimes it's that connection or relationship that can help you figure out a maiden name, a birthplace, birth date. Does this make sense to everybody? It's really easy in this day of ancestry and find my past and my heritage and family search to look at people in isolation. You go in looking for a record about one person. And when you get back before about 1900, you need to do it later as well, but we just have better records that help us put the pieces together. But before 1900, you really do need to look at people in their context, because that's how you're going to find things out about them. So I've worked with people where we've looked at everybody living on a road and realizing that these three families within a mile had a daughter named Elizabeth, the right age to marry someone's great-great-grandfather. And so let's then look at those three families with the daughter with the right name to see if we can eliminate any of them. And sometimes you can from a land transaction record or a probate file or something like that. Sometimes it's naming patterns. Because all three of the women with the right name had different fathers' names. Sometimes you can just look, the second son of each of them has her father's name, and it's not perfect, but it shows you where you want to focus your research. So this is actually a census from Scotland. And I said Scotland is one of those places, and even today, a married woman in Scotland will be Margaret, Gregg, or Little, legally. And you see here you have Margaret Gregg married to William Little, and then here's her mother. And it would be easy, if you didn't know this, to assume that this woman, who's the mother-in-law, had remarried after her, after somebody named Gregg or Grieg, I've heard it both ways, died. So part of what I often end up working with patrons is they haven't done a little bit of research about something like, what are the naming conventions? Well, this is interesting. This is 1861, if I remember correctly. And by 1881, you see almost no women in the census with their maiden name. They started conforming to the more English custom. Although legally they would have still been known by their maiden name. And we're going to see another case where this happens, and it shows a difference in laws. So from that one census, I can actually get this data with Margaret Kant, Margaret Gregg, and yes, there was a Margaret Little out of this family too. The Scots do not tend to be very creative in naming their children. But this is what happens when you have the maiden name there in the census entry. You can do this in a way that you can't with English or American census records. This is a fun one. This is an anniversary celebration article that never mentions who Zacchaeus Gould's wife is. It just says Zacchaeus Gould and wife. I've got another, and then, but he's the father of 10 children, 6 of whom are living, and his family's been a remarkably healthy one. Didn't she have the kids? So this is one of the things.
How do you know?
Yeah, but this is one of those things that, I tell people that when you're stuck on researching women, you need to research the men around them. Which, to our modern ears sounds awful, but that's what happened. So this, I would want to know more about, I'm actually descended from his brother, so it doesn't matter on this one for me. But you'd want to look and see, then did Zacchaeus Gould leave a will? Did he, is there another paper that includes her name? And so on. But you can at least from this, I didn't put the date on here, you can backtrack into about a wedding date. So this is in 1885. Okay, so this is 1872. But you can then, if it didn't have that, you could still backtrack to a date. I have several of these about this anniversary, and none of them, one of it, 4 mentions her name. One of the other things to do is don't forget to look for women, especially in things like newspapers, by Mrs. and their husband's name.
Oh.
Mrs. Jack Stalcup died, surviving her husband and several children. But again, that tells you more about her husband than her in many ways. He's still alive. You know his full name. You don't know her name. You can come up with a death date to look and see if there's more information on a death certificate, unless you're here in Maine and it's before 1892. But this is pretty typical. And you see this up through, it's in the 1960s where this actually changes. I actually have a case where have several cases where I've tracked a family in obituaries and other things like an anniversary announcement from say the 1930s to the 1970s for a family. And it's in the mid-60s 1960s where you begin to get women listed with their first name. Okay, so here's where we're gonna get a little theoretical for a minute. There are 2 major, and I'm not a lawyer, so I only know this in relation to how it affects the genealogy records. In Europe, there are 2 types of law, and different countries do things differently. England and its adjoining territories are governed by what's called common law. On the continent, France, Spain, and Italy deal with what's called civil law. And there are some differences. I am not going to talk about the civil law here because I only have another 40 minutes. But basically under civil law, women had more property rights than they did in England. They could own their own property. So you get marriage contracts because the woman has property of her own, and you get a contract that's either filed with the church where they're married in a lot of cases in Italy, or with a notary in Spain and France, and that carries over to the Spanish and French colonies in the Americas. So if you're starting to work in Quebec, you're going to need to look at different records than you would in the English colonies. And as I said, these are places where women did tend to keep their maiden name, either completely or in Spain, by having their father's name and then E for and their husband's name. Again, giving us yes, it's frustrating to not have, but just her name may give you more information than Mrs. Jack Smith. So let's talk a bit about the common law in England and the colonies. And this is next bit is a fairly famous quote, but it influences how our ancestors saw the world.
Oh my God.
Yeah, legally, until, for example, the Married Women's Property Act in England, which I think was the 1850s. Once a woman married, he owned all of the stuff she brought to the marriage. Land, clothing, anything. The husband also could take his wife's earnings. And so this is why records are so hard for women in the English-speaking world, because most of the places that are now English-speaking, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as England and the rest of the British Isles, this is the effective issue, that once a woman marries, she doesn't have a separate legal identity from her husband. She can't, she can't sue somebody. It's also harder for her to be sued and things like that. So that's part of what you need to keep in mind as for us, this doesn't make sense. But up until the mid 1800s, and in some cases, things up through the early 70s, in 1972, my mother had to get my dad's signature to get a credit card, even though she had a higher paying job than he did. So this is why so much is that way. This was the sort of decided law in English-speaking countries. Does a lot of your searching for your female ancestors now make a lot more sense? Technically, in 1773, when your several great-grandmother got married, she lost her legal identity. Yeah.
That can work to your own advantage sometimes. I've seen a will in which the husbands were signing for the wife's share of their inheritance from the father. And so you could verify then what her maiden name was, because the husband's name is on there.
Right.
Even though it's been.
Yeah.
So let's say the husband dies and she's got a son. Does she get the property, or does the firstborn son get it?
It varied. In Scotland, the widow gets a third. The oldest son the kids get a third, and the last third is the dead person's discretion. It varied on the others, but generally in the English system, widows had much more power and control than married women or single women did. So you will find cases where, especially if the widow doesn't remarry, she ends up owning property. There's interesting things with a woman's dower right and her right to parts of her husband's estate. And you literally get descriptions in a deed that split the house. And these two rooms and that shed are the widow's, and the other rooms are the son. And the son is responsible for, giving her, firewood for the year. Which is one of the reasons you want to read anything like a will really closely, because those are interesting. So here's another case where, until the 20th century, women didn't really have a legal option. You find very few women in the US naturalized in their own right before 1922. Because in 1920, voting laws changed, so suddenly citizenship made a difference for women. Before that, a woman, married. And it didn't really matter because she couldn't vote, and that was the one big difference between citizens and not. But the interesting thing is, right around 1900, the law changed. And if a woman married a non-citizen, she lost her US citizenship.
Oh my God.
Yep. So, and then World War I happens. Yeah,
Just so quickly, would the children of that union be citizens or not?
it depends. If they were born here, they were citizens.
Okay.
But if they were born abroad, if they were under 21 when the father naturalized, they also got naturalized through their father's citizenship. So it's, no, I mean, not, that's changes the lopsidedness only a tiny bit, but. So this is a list of women who, most of whom I said born in all I looked for was born in Kansas and female in this register of World War I enemy aliens in Kansas. There are 471 of them. And they actually are really nice records. So here's this woman, Edith Holzhauer. As far as I can tell, she never left Kansas in her life. I found her in census records and all of that. She's married in Kansas. Her kids are all born in Kansas. But she's registered as an enemy alien because she married, what was his name again?
No,
Something Holtzman. Her maiden name was Edith Hurley.
oh, Ellswood.
Charles,
Yeah. Yeah, Charles, and he's German, which, in 1917 was not a great thing to be in the US. You'll notice she got fingerprinted. She had to list all of her kids. Another little thing, always check and see if there's a next page. Because this was actually double-sided. There's a not very good photograph of her, lists her parents and where they were born, her siblings, she only has one. This is a listing of family members who have either fought for or against the US. Born in the USA, but she's an enemy alien for World War I. Not all states have this. They created the records and then destroyed them. But this was not that atypical. And so she would have had to, in order to vote after 1920, she had to go through being naturalized.
Do they have those in New England too?
There are some, they're really scattered though. There are World War II, not the same enemy alien, just anyone living in the state who was not a citizen and was an adult for World War II at the State Archives website. And again, the reason that's really helpful is that many of those people were born in Canada and crossed the land border, and there's not a good record. And these often give you an exact birth date, birthplace, and when they came to the US.
That's called what?
It's something like the alien registrations. It's at the Maine State Archives. So just so you know, this is the sort of atmosphere our female ancestors lived in. So yeah, you want to look at records for her and all her children. One of the things I know to people here in Maine, Maine had crappy records in the 19th century. Massachusetts had much better records, and Quebec had much better records. You'd be amazed how many people in Maine either started out in one of those two places or had a sibling move from Maine to one of those places. Although moving from Maine, it's more Massachusetts than going back to Quebec, but you do get some going back to Quebec. And I have more than once, we've been able to prove that two people were siblings when I work with a patron, and then we find the siblings death certificate in 1860s Massachusetts, or a sibling's marriage in Quebec at the same time, where there are much better records. So census, marriage, death certificates, and cemetery records. Remember, people don't tend to let strangers be buried in their family plot. So if there's somebody in your family plot, you don't know who she is,
Probably related.
probably related. And one of the things that's sometimes hard to find, but it's getting easier, is church records. For Boston and Quebec, actually for the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston and for Quebec, the Catholic records are online. The Congregational Church in New England, the Congregational Library, is working at putting those online for them. And they have some at their website that are nowhere else online. Or where all we have are the Massachusetts handbook transcriptions. So that's always, so tracking down church records can be really helpful. In Scotland and Ireland, I have figured out when you have too many people with the same name, you can, you know, if you have two women named Isabella Patterson as their married name, sometimes I can tease out which kid belongs to which woman by looking at who the witnesses were on a wedding or a baptism. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So all her identities. You know, nicknames, married names. If you've got someone who married multiple times, even if you think, oh, this is before she married husband 3, or this is after husband 2 died, still look for her under that name, just in case. Because you'll definitely want to look for any kids with that name. It's not unusual to find somebody with, this is for boys as well as girls, listed under their stepfather's name, if their father had died. You will get a lot of titles: Widow Smith, relative John Smith. Initials. Anglicized versus non-English name, especially for French Canadians. In Maine, they could be much more fluid than even our non-French Canadian ancestors in their names. So here's an interesting one. This is when my dad's sister was born. You'll notice girls were born to Mr. and Mrs. At least they get the Mrs. in there, and they don't say born to Mr. And then this is 19 years later. My grandfather died when my aunt was about 15. And you'll notice my grandmother is still listed as Mrs. Edward Jamieson. Now, I would have found this if I looked for my aunt, because she happened to be named Margaret as well. Because as I said, the Scots were not at all creative in naming their children. But you know, this is persisting into at least the 60s. Yeah, here's then the description. Couple things to notice here. The minister is from, this is in Buffalo, and the minister's from Toronto. So that's something I'd want to look at. Why is there a Toronto connection? And here you have the Robert Watt of Toronto, and then one of the bridesmaids was Miss Dorrit Watt of Toronto. So what's the relationship there? You know, it would be easy to just read this and go, yeah, it's just a fashion description. But if you were getting this, you know, like here, if you didn't know that, yeah, here you have Mrs. Edward Jamieson and the late Mr. Jamieson, but then this gives her uncle, gives you his name. So, you know, social news can actually give you details that are worth knowing.
And more rabbit holes.
Yep. Here's a good one. This is from forget which year this is from, it's early 1800s. I Googled Sarah Furman and maiden name. Was helping somebody. And you'll notice here, this, when somebody dies at over 90, you almost always get something in the newspaper up and through till World War II. And I had actually disproven a couple theories people on the internet have about one of our ancestors, because they have him listed as born in one place in a certain year, and then he died in Ottawa at 112 in like 1913. And I'm like, no, if he died at 112 at that time period, there'd be not only a death certificate, but an article in the paper. And that's a case where I'm pretty confident the negative evidence that there wasn't anything in the paper about him helps prove that case. But, you know, so this is one of the nice early ones. So records to look at, deeds. Up until well into the middle of the 19th century, you often have a case where a woman needs to release her dower right in the husband's estate when they sell it. And so you often don't get a maiden name, but you get a first name, because she has said that she is okay with this land being sold. And one of the interesting things in most of those, the recorder of deeds or the judge will actually say they questioned her not in her husband's presence. Probate records are the same thing. There's a great new experimental tool at Family Search that's tried to OCR handwritten deed and probate records. It's not perfect yet, but let me tell you, it's a pretty amazing tool. I'll try to remember to send you the link so you can send it out. It's only been going for 2 or 3 months, and it's not completely accurate, but it's often accurate enough to get you to the article, even if it doesn't tell you the whole article. So newspapers are huge, and I have some examples coming up. Military pensions. And I've already talked about how pre-1922 naturalizations often have her name and their kids' names. So here's one, it's kind of hard to see. The said Eleanor being of full age and apart from her said husband, examined by me and the contents of the above known to her, and she signs her own free will and accepted basically the compulsion, meaning the will of the husband to sell this land. So 1804. So if you didn't know the wife's maiden name, or the wife's first name, for Jacob Wingard, you at least know now she's Eleanor, or at least at the time he sold this land, her name was Eleanor. Yeah, you don't know whether it's first wife or third wife or anything like that, but you at least now have a first name. For both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, there were widows' pensions. Most of the Revolutionary War ones are online. The Civil War ones, for the most part, are not, unless you happen to have a relative who was either a Black enlisted man or a white officer in an African-American regiment, which is how I actually have a several greats uncle who is in the, was an officer in the Massachusetts 54th. And so his pension records on file is online. So, but look at these, these are Civil War widows, and you've got names there, because they would have had to prove that they were married to the man who died in order to, because the government is not just giving these out like candy, and you had to prove, and some of these files are like this thick of stuff. So again, here you have one where you have her maiden name and when they got married. Wonderful piece of paper, isn't it? That was your ancestor. Death notices searching for these in newspapers, notice we have Mrs. Polly, wife of Mr. Harvard Child. And up here we have Nancy, wife of Mr. Lincoln Stetson. So if a database for the newspapers lets you search with, some of them let you search by saying something like near 5, and that means that the first and last name are within 5 words of each other. And that's what gets these. Now, this one, the daughter died about 3 years old and was not named. But what I can tell you from the one on the daughter is, if it bleeds, it leads is not a modern invention. If one of your ancestors managed to kill him or herself in a spectacular way, there will be a newspaper article about it, like my great grandfather who died of a little too much New Year's Eve. So it sounds strange, but if you're really stuck on a woman, get to know the men around her, because that's where you're going to find these little clues. You know, the wife doing the dower release. Maybe it was a different wife's name 10 years later. Did they divorce? Did one of them run away, never to be seen again? Or did the first wife die? Yeah, so as I said, you want to look more closely at the male-dominated records because you will get clues often. County histories and town histories from the late 1800s aren't up to our standards for sourcing. But you may have people writing about their grandparents or great-grandparents with personal knowledge, the way I might write about my grandmother. When you're stuck, one of the best things you can do is go local. It's amazing what's tucked away in historical societies and little town libraries across the country. You want to look for the obituaries, and you want to look for children as well.
How would the local historical society collection, how would they categorize stuff that you would ask them a question about?
It varies, but it's going to probably be something, this is something Sharon can probably talk about as well as I can. You know, maybe in their manuscript collection, it may be the catalog has everything. You know, I've been places where the books and the manuscripts are in 2 different catalogs. I think that's changing. I think most places are trying to put them all in one now. But yeah, they can be hard to track down.
Well, would a search engine search at those local society historical?
No, there are a couple places to look. First of all, go to their site and see if they've got an on-site catalog.
Yeah.
If they don't, you can send an email. Although many of the really small ones are volunteer run, which is why I suggest actually starting with the biggest library in the county. Because almost always the biggest library in the county has some level of special collection or genealogical collection. So as soon as somebody mentions Waldo County to me, I'm handing them Sharon's email address. Because there's stuff here that's nowhere else. But I'll show you a couple examples and talk about how I found them. But yeah, there's WorldCat, which is for books, and Archive Grid, which is done by the same company that does WorldCat for archives. And for example, I just discovered a couple weeks ago through Archive Grid, there's a steamship museum of America. Did any of you know there was a steamship museum of America?
Only recently. And maybe you shared it.
I mean, but think about that.
And where is it, in Ohio?
I don't know, but their catalog is accessible from Archive Grid, which is how I found it. But yeah, we were looking for steamship stuff because one of this person's ancestors had been on worked on a steamship. Didn't find anything there, but you know.
Kansas City.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
Google wasn't.
you know, it's really nice. This is my couple great grandfather's little book where he wrote something down every day. Yeah, he wrote it, but most of the stuff is what, he was a farmer. He didn't go into town that much. So it's, my wife went to visit her sister, our niece stopped on her way to my brother's, stuff like that. This is actually the Danvers Archival Center. If any of you have ancestors in Danvers, Massachusetts, you want to stop there at some point. Same collection. This is a letter from my several greats aunt to her future sister-in-law, who's my several greats grandmother. In that same collection, a cousin who collected all of these. And when she died, she donated them to the Danvers Library. I was only about, I don't know, 13 or 14 when she died, so it was before, but quite frankly, I'd rather have these things there. I don't have to worry about their preservation, other people can see them. So as nice as it would be for me to own these, they're in a better spot. Because it's climate controlled and not humid. Again, here you have obituaries where you have just the woman's Mrs. Jack Miller and Mrs. Kenny. But this one you'll notice it gives her father's name. The other one gives you the name of her daughter, and sisters and brothers. So again, you can start to flesh out a bit of a tree from this. And go from there. Naming patterns. This is Louisa May Alcott and her three sisters. Notice Bronson, May, Sewell, and May. This is a case where their mother's maiden name was May. It's not May, like in the month, it's the second name. And so pay attention, especially in the early 19th century. Middle names are at least as likely to be family names as they are to be a second given name. Yeah.
I can't believe this. I was just looking at my family tree because it's Chatfield. And I found out last week that we're related to the Bronx.
Oh.
Boy, I can't believe it, yeah.
So, yeah, Google does know everything. It is sometimes worth just Googling a person's name. Now, obviously, if your grandmother was Mary Smith, who married Johnson, Mary Smith Johnson's not going to get you very far. But if you do something like, if you know her death date, you can put that in. If you know her birthplace, you can put that in the search. Just a little promo, this Thursday and next Thursday, I'm doing a program for the State Library Genealogy Club called Search Like a Librarian. If you're not on my list and want to be, email me and I will add you to the list and you can watch my Search Like a Librarian program.
Sharon, can you add that to our recording email thing?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah,
You were just talking about the names and, mothers and fathers and so forth. I've seen a lot of examples where the mother's maiden name becomes particularly a son's first name.
right.
So if her
It's-
name is Gardner, then you have Gardner Smith.
And that's
That's
definitely, it happened here in New England some. It's a very southern tradition here in the US. To the point that I went to college with people with, their mother's maiden name as their first name. Sometimes when it wasn't really a good fit. So here's one of my fun ones. Talk about people who live to be over 100. Elizabeth Merriam married Jesse Putnam. They were farmers in Danvers, Massachusetts. I'm guessing she barely left Essex County. Because when you're a farmer with 12 kids, you're not traveling much. So she died at 102 years, 10 months, and 6 days. So I put her, fortunately, her name is not that common. I put that in a search engine, Google. And the first thing that popped back to me was this image. Anyone want to take a wild guess where I might have fit? This is not at Danvers Archival Center, I'll tell you that much. It's actually at the Niagara Falls, Ontario Public Library. But think about it. At the time this was taken, I did a little research. it would have been, $40, $45 modern equivalent to get a photo printed. So you're not doing them just to put them in an album or, so I'm guessing what happened is she's in Danvers. Grandchild moves to central New York. That grandchild's grandchild moves over by Niagara Falls, Ontario. And then when that grandchild is cleaning out grandma's attic, takes stuff to the local historical society, and there you go. You have, one of the reasons to trace siblings when you can find them is if your ancestor wrote letters to a sibling who had moved to Kansas, that letter is probably going to end up in a Kansas historical society, not one here in Maine. Does that make sense to everybody? It's going to be where the letter ended up. Another interesting case, this is one of my problem families. One reason it's nice when you know two people's names, when I looked for Samuel Weston, the OCR didn't catch this. But when I looked for Julia Horton, it did. And this is the only record of their marriage, because in 1811, Pennsylvania was not recording. So, when you have two names, again, this is a case where the relationship helps you find something. Of course, this is one of the next things we found. Some of you have seen this one before, but it's my second favorite all-time one of these. As I hate to be interrogated, I thought proper to take this method of informing my friends and enemies also, that for reasons which to me appear sufficient, I have separated blah, blah, blah. Should any persons feel desirous to know more than what I have here communicated, I would refer them to some of my neighbors who know more about the matter than I do.
Oh, dear.
Now, I read this as he's accusing her of adultery.
Right.
Does anybody else get that feeling? So anyhow, so I found his mother's diary and had said that Julia had left. So I went looking for this. I went looking for the divorce. Couldn't find it. So then one of those nice little genealogical semi-miracles. About 20 years ago, I woke up one day and there was this email in my inbox. And this is back in the days of dial-up. And a woman had tracked me down. She had seen a letter at eBay on sale for its 1925 stamp. And it had already sold, but she was able to transcribe the text. And it was from Julia's brother to a friend of hers. And she had not thought to download the pictures. And it was taken down by the time she found me. So this is Julia's side of the story from her brother. He accuses her of adultery. She accuses him of cruelty. I don't know which one is right. I do know that they did eventually, a couple of years later, get the marriage annulled through the Pennsylvania state legislature, in with all of the incorporations of things and building roads and such. And being who I am, I have called both the State Library of Pennsylvania and the Legislative Records Department, and there is nothing more on this, because I would love to know the rest of the story. And what's worse is their kids exchange letters that are at Danvers Archival Center, where they talk about the big disruption, but never say what it was. This is my favorite. I just had to put this in here. So for those of you thinking of that women 200 years ago were meek and all of that. So here's this very typical one, right? A week later, we get the rebuttal. Where she talks about, poor creature, he might with security have saved himself this expense of doing the ad. Unless he needs to serve the printers, he does all others, meaning not pay. As to his bed, I was crowded from that by his taking a worthless wretch into it. And as to board, the family was supplied by my labor while I remained in. So, anyhow, this is my favorite so far. She was probably not some quiet, meek
Yeah.
Woman. Church records, here's another good one.
Oh.
Oh, my
From
God.
1615. A lot of what we think of as old-fashioned fruitery is Victorian. And pre-Victorian, you get this in the church register. So here's another paternity claim. They went after the fathers because, and one of the things I often say to people are, if it involves money, the records get created and kept. So why would essentially a bastardy bond? Child support. The elders of the church are saying, who's the father so we can go after him? And if we can't go after him, we can at least go after the parish he's from to pay for this kid, not us. Does that make sense to everyone? Oh, here's another one. Alice Harrison had a son christened named John, base begotten by one Edmund Brooke of the greenhouse. At least this one names the father. But you know, why do you want to go looking for things? This is another illegitimacy one where you can see again, you're going after someone from a different parish to look at getting money. This is the Scottish Kirk Session records, which for those of you who are Presbyterian, the Kirk Session is like the deacons and the elders and they enforce the rules, especially in 1787 in Scotland. And so this is Magdalene Dryden acknowledged that she had lately brought forth a child in uncleanness and being interrogated, selected or declared that Thomas Rutherford Mason in was the father. Again, yes, they cared about morality, but they also cared about money, which is why they wanted that guy's name. And this is one basically where she has to confess and repent to be able to take communion. Here's another one. These are free to, you pay to print or download, but they're free to read at Scotland's People. Some interesting, and so this is both, this is one where it took place in one parish and the baby was born in another and so on. Here's one, she's, Helen Valentine is confessing to the sin of fornication, admitted her being the mother of 6 illegitimate children. Due to the aggravated nature of this one, the local church doesn't deal with it. They bump it up to the next level of the church hierarchy. Here in New England, they did also keep fornication records. These are in the town records, not the church records, at places like Family Search. If you haven't gone through these for your ancestors, you want to. Because just about anyone whose first kid came less than 9 months after the wedding got called up in front of the local elders. So these people were married and you're getting called up in front of the elders. Here you have similar things. You also in these get when people join the church or transfer to another church. So these are under town records or church records at Family Search by the town. Here's one of my favorite ancestors. Oops. Harriet Waterman marries young to Warren Augustus poor. They had 3 kids, one dies. Story I heard as growing up was that she left the family never to be seen again, ran off with another man. So in 1865, she's with Warren and their 2 living children. Have not found her in 1870. He's still in Danvers with the kids. Her father had divorced her mother and married wife number 2 and lived out in Wisconsin. She's mentioned in his probate as Harriet Blank, wife of Blank, and there are literally blank, lines drawn. I pick her up in 1880 in the census in New Jersey with a boarder named Thomas Abbott. She marries him the next year. this is where it gets interesting. 1884, Warren dies. Same year, she's back in Salem, Massachusetts, living as Harriet Core in the same house her son is. So I find her a couple years in the city director, and then she disappears again. Can't find her in 1900. She dies in 1902. So I have these lost years. I have two sets of my own showing you one. Did she marry somebody else? I don't know. Was she just living here in Maine and didn't generate any records? Who knows? Did she go back to New York City and disappear into, living with a cousin? I don't know. Get the whole story. This is my grandparents. Yes, she's accusing my grandfather of abuse. I don't really know his side of the story, but I can tell you I shared a house with her at one point. Not justifying any abuse, but let me tell you,
Piece of work. Huh?
she was, I mean, the fact that my mother turned out anywhere near sane with these two parents is amazing. So again, I put together a time, I could talk forever about timelines because they are really helpful. Here's the interesting part. April 1840, my mother, it's not only the Scots who weren't creative with names. Notice my mother Barbara and my grandmother Barbara. And you probably now, if you didn't already know what the B and BJ stands for, you can probably figure it out. So in April, it's listed in the census with my grandmother and mother. According to a nephew's online tree, he marries wife number 2 in 1940. Son is born 10 months later. And then later that year is that newspaper article about the abuse. So I'm still working on figuring this one out. Because without the timeline, I didn't, the order of these didn't click. So you all see the problem I've got there, right? That the marriage is coming before the divorce.
Are you creating an Excel for
Yes.
each person in your family? Like with all the, where you're getting records from and stuff?
Yeah. I use Excel for these because I didn't put, like, I have a column that's a number,
Mhm.
so this is record one, and so I can sort it by other columns.
This is
and
your
then have it
own
go
work.
back, yeah. So anyhow, my grandfather eventually died. Obituary, surviving are his wife, 2 sons, both living with the family, his father, a brother, a sister.
No name. Oh, this is,
Who's missing?
Why her?
My mother.
yeah.
We got his wife, but I'm guessing that this was written by wife number 2, which is why there's no acknowledgement of my mother, who is the daughter of wife number 1. This is also that family.
Wow.
This is his parents. The young man, Kennedy, thought my grandfather wasn't treating my grandmother, that Jessie Sears we saw at the beginning, well, and so Kennedy put Rough on Rats in my great grandfather's tea, hoping to kill him. Some of the newspapers of the time say my great grandmother was, completely innocent, pure as fresh snow. Others say, wait a minute, she got a little too close to him. So again, this is in the if it bleeds, it leads category. This was front page news in Boston the entire trial. And then when one of my grandmother's frustrations was evidently nobody told her this had happened before she married my grandfather. And the name is distinctive enough that people still remembered this. So yeah, so look at all of these nice. Here's an interesting one, women's suffrage. These are the 1911 England census. And there was a movement for suffragettes to Yeah, no persons here, only women. If we can't vote, you're not getting us counted in your census. And there were plenty of these.
Oh, sure.
And this one, again, it's refused to fill it out. So almost done. Nobody's ever accused me of being short-winded, so I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Oh, that's great.
Society columns. Again, reading this quickly, you wouldn't necessarily pick this up, but look at the one I put the arrow for. You've got Mrs. SRB Pingree's father's name here, which means you probably have her maiden name. Now, it may be not quite because, you know, maybe a stepfather that isn't indicated or something like that. But it also tells you where he was living. So you can work back from that to see, you know, this is 1892, so no 1890 census, but Mrs. SRB Pingree probably got married before Maine started keeping vital records well. So there may not be a marriage record of this couple to get her maiden name from, but now you have it. Not that Jones is that helpful, but. Again, this is a case of, it's not big earth-shattering news, but it lets you see who your ancestor was as a person. So she's 94 years old, she's still out doing her shopping. But notice a couple above it, you have a marriage announcement. Then, you know, you get someone, you know, they've been out west on a trip. Here oh, this is a funny one. This is the Louisa Page Weston who was in the first, in that photograph. And the story I heard was that my couple greats grandfather, William Lowe Weston, who was the son of the couple that was divorced in Pennsylvania, didn't want to spend the money on a remodel. And about a month after he died, look what is in the social news. Because he was a banker, they had the money, he just didn't want to spend it. How about this one? Chicken thieves, family sitting out to dinner. 4 chickens were stolen. Well, the family was eating dinner at 6:30. How's that? You know, again, this is not earth-shattering, but this is what can make this is actually for a friend, and this Maud's grandfather and great uncle came to the US from Ireland, and they'd been here about 3 months when they got picked up by the police for being rowdy with a couple kegs of beer on a Saturday night. And the friend I did this for, research for, is like, how much more stereotypically Irish can you get? You barely here and getting in a fight with your brother, and you're both, you know, I was reading the article, they were both drunk enough, it wasn't much of a fight. Here's a fun one. I'd love to know who the informant was on this. I'm guessing it was either the 20-year-old brother or the 13-year-old sister. 15-year-old Catherine does as she pleases.
Everybody else is working or at school, but she doesn't.
Defiant.
Yeah.
There you go.
Left letters. This is a fascinating thing. You know, without the good, you know, we've all gotten used to having 911 addresses where every house has a real address. You used to get letters left at the post office. And these lists are nice because, you know, at this point, postage was relatively expensive. So you weren't going to send a letter somewhere you didn't think it had a good chance of getting to the person you were writing to. And this one's interesting. I've rarely seen this. This is out in California. I actually went out to and gave a couple programs in California at NGS a couple of years ago. So I was looking for local color. And this is interesting because in this one, they've divided the men from the women. Most of them have them all together. But for some reason, this newspaper divided them that way. But again, it tells you that, say, for this, Margaret Compton or Margaret Corn or whoever, that somebody in their life had reason to think they were in San Francisco at that point. And Danvers Mirror. Those of you who know me know I'm, in addition to being the crazy genealogy person, I'm also the crazy cat lady. So I like that top one. Daisy is not that kind of cat to eat the copy. But the reason I found this Robert K. Sears, probably beginning to recognize my family names by now, was my couple great grandfather. And he went on vacation with Francis Dodge up to this is from Danvers, up to New Hampshire. Now, if I didn't know the relationship between these two men, I'd want to, because again, Robert probably didn't walk down the street, get a block from the train station and say to some guy he barely knows, want to go fishing with me for a week. Right? There's a good chance that Francis Dodge and Robert Kent Sears know each other some other way. And that can lead me to other records. Maybe they went to school together, which isn't going to help me with their wives' names. Turns out they married sisters.
Oh, cool.
And so, they're brothers-in-law. They seem to have liked each other and they went off without their wives.
That's the key.
Yeah. So yeah, that's,
What, that they liked each other?
so that's what I've got for now. I hope, a lot of what I wanted to do with this is I've more and more, I'm showing results and then talking about how I found something, because I think it, at least for me, it sinks in better than if I listen to somebody say for 10 minutes, you need to look for this in an obituary. I'm going to show you the obituary and then tell you why I found that one. Because I think that, I try to find at least slightly amusing ones, because I also figure people remember better. But the big thing out of this is, yes, tracing women can be difficult. But there are societal reasons for that. It's not just your family's being a pain. And you want to really look deeply, and that there is more, especially in the 19th century, often than we think of. So.
Well, does anyone have any questions for DJ?
Not a question, just a frustration, and I find more and more death marriage records from local communities with Jane died. And that's the legal document. And the only reason why I'm accepting it as proof is because it's in the town I'm looking for, it's around the same time of the other things that I know, but really just her first name, nothing else?
I have a case, one of my problem ancestors, his marriage record literally says Ithamar Wilkins married Lois on June 3rd, 1736. No last name for her. I usually, when I started this, I was like, I wonder if this is a bad transcription. I finally tracked down the microfilm of the original, and nope. I'm leaning towards the theory that a lot of the Wilkinses of Danvers, Topsfield, Middleton, Massachusetts married second cousins. And so I'm guessing her name may have been Wilkins as well. I don't know for certain, but that's kind of my current working hypothesis, that she was, and the town clerk knew who she was. I have an ancestor who's town clerk and Wiscasset back when it was Pownell Borough, records every marriage in the town but his own. He knew who he married, right? So, yes.
In Ireland, two women had the same name. And there was only about 8 years between them. my great grandmother. And they came over on a ship, and both had the same name. Would it be more likely that they were cousins or a young aunt and niece?
There's no way to tell.
Okay.
But if
I'm
they
just
have,
only asking in terms of naming protocol.
yeah, no, I'm fascinated by names, so I hang out like at name nerds at Reddit and stuff. And there's this whole thing about, my third cousin used this name, so I can't use it, and our ancestors didn't care. There's a reason there are like 37 nicknames for Elizabeth. Because there were 37 different Elizabeths in the town, and so they all had to have a different, yeah. I joke that, my parents were not creative. My mother's Barbara, was Barbara, my grandmother was Barbara. And I'm just really glad it was a cousin that got the nickname Barbie, because I'm not a Barbie. And there just really wasn't any worry about having cousins with the same name. And that's for English speaking. In most other countries in Europe, you actually end up with a tradition where all the kids, like all the boys, have their first name is Johann, and then you get Friedrich, Heinrich, and so on, and they're called by that second name. It's actually called a call name. The same thing happens in Quebec, which is why, again, with the Quebec record, with French Canadians moving to the US and interacting with an English system on names is not always a pleasant result. Oh, way in the back.
It happened to me on a couple of different occasions, women in particular, although there were some men, and these are all mostly Irish, English, where the woman, I couldn't find her, she was going by her name on the census, or her original, when she listed as a child, is Emily one, but she then becomes Sarah.
Mhm.
And
Really,
and I know, I'm absolutely sure it's the same person, because I have.
Yeah.
Before
before,
the names just change.
here in the US, sort of in the English speaking culture, before the middle of the 20th century, people were very casual about their names in many ways. But you get 2 world wars where you have to track soldiers and then veterans, and you get the start of Social Security in the late 1930s, where they're tracking everybody. In 1870, it didn't matter if you'd gone by Emily and then become Sarah, and then later became Jane, because you didn't have to connect your work history with your birth date with your pension. And so people tended to be much less, and then, and that's forgetting the whole anglicizing names. I've come across with helping friends and patrons, about 5 women named Leocadia coming from Poland. And, all of them chose a different English name.
The other issue is I have ancestors that are Benjamin Franklin and Sarah Elizabeth, and their children are children of Ben and Elizabeth and Frank and Sarah, and just interchange both names. That they interchange. I happen to know who they are, but
Yeah.
Benjamin Franklin Stanley and Sarah Elizabeth Whitney.
Yeah, but that's one of the things that I'm in a group of people who are basically professional or close to it, genealogists. And once a month, we pick apart an article out of the National Genealogical Society quarterly. And one of the interesting ones we did recently, it was a case that, to me and the other 2 New Englanders were like, why did this need to be written up? Whereas everybody else from around the world, the other 20 people in the group, were completely confused, but it was a French Canadian name and how it morphed. And the 3 of us from New England were like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. We've seen that, Pelletier become Pelkey, Fournier become Forky. And it's not even getting into the alternate names and all of that. But it was really interesting how the three of us who had all done research in New England, although none of us have French Canadian ancestors, but we've all done enough of this research with helping other people that we were like, this didn't need to be a 20-page article in the quarterly.
I get when I'm looking at descendants for DAR applications for New England ancestors, they get all in the huff about, is her name Mary or Polly? And you think, whoops.
Yeah.
Or, like,
Answer is yes.
or, they were just, I mean, Nancy and Ann, people say, what? Well, that was, that was.
And I've also seen a Hannah decide to be a Nancy
Oh, yeah.
because it was more popular,
Hmm.
or you never know. Maybe she went to school and there were 5 Hannahs in the classroom.
We had a good question in the chat. So Jeff asked, can you comment on the term spinster, specifically in an 1825 deed for a woman who otherwise seems to be already married?
Scandal.
She may actually be a spinster, where the term came from with spinning wool.
Hmm.
She may have worked in a mill. That's the beginning of where you get mill girls. There's a professor down at, it's either USM or UNE, who's written a fascinating book about stories about mill girls and the cautionary tales about going to the city to work at a mill as opposed to staying safe on the farm. But it's the 1820s is right about when you start getting mill work, and women, even sometimes after they marry, continuing to do mill work, especially before first child is born. So that would be my first reaction. I don't know for certain. It's possible it's something else, but that would be my first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I would actually look into whether she was actually working either piecework at home or at a factory as a possibility.
Cool.
Did you see the recent, couple of us are in DAR, and they recently reshared a post from William Dollard about the 90 ways to find records to find mother's maiden name list?
I've seen others floating around before.
I actually bought some copies today. If I wanted to.
Oh, thank you.
So, or I can email it to you too, because it was like, oh yeah, she said it. So there's a lot of cool things, but it's not anything that we don't know or we haven't tried, but it's just nice that it's a comprehensive
Yeah.
list that somebody put together. Yeah, exactly.
One of the few things I actually recommend people spend money on, if for general genealogy, is legacy family tree webinars. I will be honest and disclose, I've done a couple of them for them. My royalties are like $1.73 every 6 months. But unlike most of the other places, they actually do pay royalties to the people who do their programs. I also get a free lifetime subscription to,
Oh my God.
which is much more than the
Yeah.
royalties.
What's the name of the thing?
It's family tree webinars. They're owned by Legacy. And they now have over 2,000 webinars to watch. From 15-minute, here's how you do this technology thing, up through these hour-long webinars by Elizabeth Schoen Mills. When you see what work she's done to find a maiden name or to untangle 2 women with the same name. And there's another one, and I can't remember who did it off the top of my head or the exact title, but it was something like 5 wives in a feather bed. And he practically proves that a man had 5 wives from 1 line in a will. I mean, the way he did it was absolutely amazing. Judy Russell's had some good ones there. So I'm sort of surprised they let me speak. Because it's all of when Ancestry rolls out a new DNA thing, they get Blaine Bettinger to talk about it. So, and the other 2 there, I'll off topic, but Ari Wilkins and Nika Smith are 2 women doing fascinating work on African-American research. That even if you don't have African-American ancestors, that you have Irish or Ashkenazi Jewish, where you have the same thing where the records peter out right as you get to the edge of what DNA can do in the like 1820s to 40s, you know, that 7 generations that, although I've now proven an ancestor, a thing with the family, a couple who were married in Hoyt in Scotland in 1785, that all of us just, you know, and use that's my Scottish records. Yeah.
I'll echo the Legacy Family Tree seminars, and if you get on their email list, they're free for a week.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So you got a week to get it before it becomes $10 or whatever they are,
yeah.
or whatever their annual.
And- or- Two things. They run sales periodically.
They what? Oh.
They run sales. It's $50 for a year. It's really, for what you get, it's pretty reasonable. But the other thing is that if you watch live, they give a discount code that's valid for a week.
Hmm.
So even if you don't want to wait for a sale, you can knock $10 or $5 or $10 off the price. So, that's, you know, I'm half Scots, half New England Yankee. I have to think of things like that. But it's one of the few, you know, most of the educational stuff isn't really worth it. That's online
It's pricey.
and it's pricey. The two things I've done recently, a lot of, you know, I have to, you know, I know nothing about researching in Italy or Greece. But the two things I do, there are a couple people at YouTube I've been following who do pretty good stuff for free. And, you know, I love having the access to the fan. I had paid for it for years before I spoke for them, because the man who runs it has organized a series where there's a webinar for every state in the country, how to get started in that state. And for those of us who, I mean, I learn well by reading. I'm a librarian after all, but I also, on some things, I like being able to watch and move along with something. And so I have the two screens where I have the webinar going and I'm doing it on the other screen. But, you know, they've got, yeah, 2 screens is one of the other, you can get a second monitor relatively cheaply these days. You know, I just bought a like 30-inch TV on sale at Walmart to be my second screen. But it's a case of, I used to, before I became a librarian, I did editing and, you know, newsletters and such. And trust me, once you get used to 2 screens, it's really hard to go back to one. So, yeah.
So when did our country start issuing, if you wanted to leave the country, passports?
That's an interesting question with a harder answer than you'd think. Passports were not actually required, except for a couple times around the Civil War and World War I, until the 1950s.
Oh my God, you gotta be kidding.
But you could always get them. And many, particularly by the late 1800s, if people were going overseas, they did. The other thing you have that's very helpful in the first half of the 1800s are what are called Seamen's or Mariners Protection Certificates. And they're not a full passport, but they're proving that somebody, a particular man, was born in what's now the US. And a lot of those, I've got some great examples of commenting. What happens is they had to bring proof of their birth, which often would have been a baptism certificate. And so if they didn't have one, they'd go to the church in the town they were born in, and the minister would look it up, and sometimes he'd find it, and sometimes the troublesome times of 1775 meant that it wasn't recorded. And, you know, and some of them, they even say, you know, this person was born in Sicily, but he now lives in Salem, Massachusetts. And he's not a British citizen, so no, you can't impress him for the British Navy. And those are scattered. And a lot of the passport stuff is scattered as well. A lot of it's at Ancestry, but I have found little pockets of stuff elsewhere. But yeah, I'm guessing that by the early 1900s, someone going overseas, meaning not Canada or Mexico, probably had close to a 50-50 chance of having a passport just for the ease of travel. But yeah, I mean, before 9/11, I grew up partly here in Maine and partly in Buffalo. And, my dad's family was on the other side of the line. There's a reason those Toronto people were in the one marriage article. My parent, I wasn't with them, but they were still laughing about, because we lived like 8 minutes from the bridge. And they get home and they're laughing. I'm like, what's so funny? He said, we pulled up to the customs place, the booth. The man said anything. Dad said no. And he waved them on. It's just like, literally 2 words spoken to go through customs. Now, my parents were fairly respectable looking middle-aged people. One time when my brother and a cousin of ours and a friend of my brother's were in a car together, they actually got asked if they had any Chinese people hiding in the trunk. I mean, I'm sure the customs agents feel like, they get bored at the end of the 8-hour day. Now, the only time I ever had trouble crossing the border was more than once. They asked me why I was going to Canada, and I said to go to X library. And they'd look at me and go, no, really, where are you going? And I'd have to pull out my research notes and say, yes, I am going to the Brock University Library to work on my senior thesis. Or what? They never believed that. Absolutely never believed